One of the things that I did in this period of time as well, I ended up adjuncting a class at my law school, my former law school, University of Dayton, because I had not taken or been exposed to open source licensing for very good reasons. I mean, as I said, it wasn't really mainstream at the time I was in law school, but I don't know that law schools really focus on open source licensing as a specific class. It might be included in a general intellectual property class. It might be included in a copyright class, but the way classes are structured in law school, unless you have someone who really knows open source, you don't necessarily have someone to teach that class. So I volunteered to teach an adjunct class on open source licensing for students because if I could have learned about open source when I was in law school or even going further back while I was still an undergrad, who knows what trajectory my career might have taken from there.
So as you remember, like you were teaching students, but I assume you were also helping your colleagues, like within your team, who were less focused on open source, but still needed to understand it to some extent. Do you remember what people had the most challenges with understanding about open source?
I think early on it was just whether or not open source licenses could be enforced. But then once the Jacobson versus Katzer decision came out, there was this line in the sand to say, yes, they're enforceable, but there were still questions about other open source licenses because that particular license on that particular set of facts was a decision in favor of the open source developer. But other licenses have different terms, and case law is always very specific to the issue at hand. So it can't necessarily just flip over to the next case, and you can't just have a one size fits all decision. They're all very specific. So there were still lots of questions about other types of licenses and provisions in other licenses and whether those would be enforceable. And going back to your comment a little earlier, Phil, about the AI, this is where I think the community and industry and the world may just run away with things before we get to case law or legislation that can set up that rubric. Because as the ecosystem was developing, as people were adopting these licenses and using them, there are conventions that have become part of how you deal with open source that are almost set in stone or that are very well accepted, even though there haven't been case law decisions on those. And people follow those conventions because that's the way it's been done. And that's the way it continues to be done in the absence of having a very specific regime or a very specific case that says, do it this way.
Yeah, and I find that to be helpful too, which kind of goes back to the whole community of legal experts in that domain, right? Because I was always taught by the IP lawyers that I worked with that, when there isn't case law, and a judge is trying to figure out the relevant aspects of a license, they may look at the author of the license to see what they thought they meant when they wrote the license. And they might also go to, again, some set of legal experts through amicus briefs or however, other kind of voluntary submissions to the court to say, well, we as a collective who have looked at this for the last 20 years, we think it means this. And so that plays some kind of role in a judge's decision. Then, of course, it's the user of the license for their particular case. Also, their opinion takes some level of account too. But so that community of legal experts, and there's a great set of them now, and David Marr happens to still be one of them, right? As are you, I expect. You've been doing this for a while now. But that learning and that understanding over time, that makes the case. And so it is interesting where we are now with AI, because I go to some of these events where these legal experts get together, and there's interesting debate amongst all of them as to exactly what this thing does mean even within that legal community, trying to figure it out.
And it's not just one legal community you need to worry about. This is worldwide. So there's different legislative frameworks that apply in other countries, and somehow those have to be normalized, especially when you're working across multiple geos or across the world. It's a very fun and interesting and challenging area to try to work in.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes to me, a lot of things that are happening in law are a little bit like, I don't know, magic. It's kind of written down, but it's not always exactly written down, or it's not happening in the way how I interpreted what's written down. And then it all becomes this mysterious thing where many of us just like, I'm not a lawyer. I'm walking away from this conversation before, before I can be implied for anything that I said here.
That's part of why I would love to see more open source integrated into undergraduate curriculums and law school curriculums. I just feel like people need to get immersed in these communities earlier and earlier because, you mentioned Grok Law a little bit ago. I probably haven't looked at that in well over a decade, but I remember reading through it when I was learning about open source. And once it started to become a little bit more of my palette or my menu of work that I was doing, there's so much out there now that you almost could have an entire degree around open source, or at least a specialty around open source, particularly when you merge in AI into the mix. Having a program or a certification on that, I think would be wonderful for people who are now entering into the workforce.
100%. And like, I finished university, I got my diploma in 2008. I'm pretty sure that we were using Linux, but the fact that it was open source and what that meant and all those kind of things, I don't think anyone ever talked about it during class. We were focusing on, programming languages and algorithms and math and physics and a lot of things I've never used again after university ended. But if we had like a class on the very basics of open source and like open source licenses or just software licensing in general, not to turn us into lawyers, just to have a baseline understanding of licenses and copyright exists, what it is about, and maybe a mention of open source when that field started to firm up enough to add it to a curriculum, it would have been tremendously helpful, because as you're diving into your career and then all of a sudden you bump into these things and it's like, oh wait, what? License, and what do I have to do with that? I'm just writing software, like it's not my problem, but then it is your problem. So then not even like trying to get that understanding on the spot is just, I mean, it's frightening sometimes, especially when you're, the software developer just sitting on the bottom of the supply chain in a way, and just trying to figure out how you, as a little drop in the ocean, like how all that relates to you and what kind of consequences things can have, what you can do, what you cannot do, what are the things that you might be able to do, but you need to ask the lawyers first at the company where you're working. So it would have been amazing.